Right, so sorry about that. We're ready to go now. So we're going to be talking this evening about planning permissions. So I'm going to, speak probably for around 20 minutes. Then we're going to open it up to questions. And then, maybe if anyone has some specific experience to share about planning or dealing with potential planning problems. Otherwise, I've got plenty that I can share, as well as like practical examples. So we'll see when we get there. So we're just one thing, by the way. Yeah, he says understanding the UK planning system for profitable investments. I have no experience in planning in Scotland and no experience in planning in Northern Ireland. So in reality, I'm going to be speaking about primarily English planning, but because, some of you know, I do stuff also in Wales. There are some differences, but not major. The main differences between Wales and England is that there's virtually no permitted development in Wales. Everything has to go through full planning, with very few exceptions. So yeah, England and Wales planning. So what is planning permission? So it's basically applying for and receiving formal consent from a local planning authority for new developments, significant modifications. That's generally modifications that are external to a property, like adding something, changing something that's going to be seen from outside, or changes in the use of a property. A change in use of a property can be something as simple as going from operating a house as a standard buy-to-let and changing it to operating it as an HMO. Even if it's only a 3 or 4 bedroom house, but we're renting it out by the room, it's no longer standard residential. It's still residential, but it's a different class, and that is subject to planning, unless, as we'll see in a little while, there's permitted development that allows us to make that change. Obviously, planning is there for a purpose. It's although obviously there's a lot of complications, planning is there so that people aren't building anything anywhere in any sort of way. So it is satisfying general goals, but obviously it can create complications for developers, and clearly sometimes there may be local authorities that are overzealous in applying rules, or applying rules which actually aren't there. So planning is a legal requirement. So obviously, if we don't comply with planning, and in fact, there's two things. If we don't comply with planning and we're found out, but I'm not recommending hiding from that, then there are different levels. It can go from a simple, did you realize that you've done this without planning? And it's possible to say, sorry, and say, can we put in a application to, to adjust that. Next stage is obviously can be enforcement, which is requiring to put back the property to previous state, or apply for the retrospective planning. But enforcement is like stricter, because it prevents us from using a property in a certain way. There can be fines, and in the worst case, demolition orders. So when is planning needed? Yeah, new buildings, major renovations, extensions, change of use. And then there are extensions to that. Things that don't normally require planning may require planning when specifically if it's a listed building. If it's a listed building, then have to consult the relevant authorities, and also conservation. Conservation zone is like a little in between, like listed building and standard buildings. There can be special requirements that apply to all buildings. And then where it's not needed, so small scale improvements under permitted development or change of use. We say here, in fact, small scale improvements. It doesn't have to be that small scale, because it's possible to, in some cases, to do a large commercial to residential conversion in England, like converting offices into flats in under permitted development. And then, yeah, minor internal modifications, and yeah, some temporary building projects. So importance of planning permission, yeah, defines what can be built and how land can be used. Ensures that developments align with local planning policies and strategic growth initiative. This thing here, local planning policies, is a key thing, because in general, some people are thinking, are the council going to accept my planning application or not? In reality, there are local planning policies, which are local government defined policies, which explain what can be done, what can't be done in different areas of a town or yeah, regional area. And in some cases, there can be general, and in some cases can be extremely specific. One example of that is often as developers, we're looking at doing HMOs rather than standard houses because we got a much higher cash flow. And some local councils will have very clearly defined planning policies with how and in what conditions are HMOs permitted. It might say, for example, that parking is needed. It might say that parking is not needed if it's within a certain distance of public transport. It might say if there are other HMOs in a certain area, then we can't add additional ones. And when there's very precise planning policies, and it's worth, although we are going to be speaking later about using good planning consultants and not trying to save money by doing things yourself, it's always the same when you're using like good professionals. Don't just expect them to do it, but understand yourself what are the local planning policies. So coming back to this example of an HMO, if it exists, read it. It might be a 10 or 15 page document, but it's worth getting to know, understanding what the local policies are to get, and then speak with the local planning consultants to get their opinion. But at least then you're speaking like from a, not from nothing. You actually got some understanding, and you may be asking then specific questions. Yeah, so understanding planning is preventing legal issues, project delays, and potential fines. Project delays obviously is a really important thing if we're buying a property and developing it using bridging finance, because bridging finance, obviously we're agreeing specific timeframes in which we need to exit that, which is either refinance to term finance or selling on part or all of a development. And delays related to planning can seriously impact that. And planning, yeah, enhances property value, marketability, long-term investment success. It is possible sometimes to take some shortcuts when developing something, but when you're going to sell it, then the buyers are going to look carefully, has all planning been respected? And then we got the nice thing, supporting sustainable development, etc. A brief overview of the types of planning permission. So we've got full planning permission. So that's where we're putting in a full planning with all the details. That applies for all new developments and most conversions or major renovations. We're putting sufficient information in there so that everything can be either approved or rejected in one go, and we're ready to go. Interestingly, we've got here what's called outline planning permission. There isn't, strictly speaking, a difference in submitting outline planning permission and full planning permission. We might make it in the notes. But when there's outline planning permission, that means that the planning can be granted, but subject to a lot of different conditions. And often those conditions will mean that before we can start the works, we have to have details approved in writing before we can start. So if we know all that and we can put all that in the full planning application, we're reducing the number of things that the planning officers can ask us to deal with afterwards. Interesting, today I was filling in this is on a joint venture. I was filling in for the lender their out of 100 different documents that they're asking for. These are some of the last things we were dealing with. The lender was asking questions about the construction, so asking samples of construction contracts, contractors' insurance, different questions, getting a license from the architect to be able to use the plans. And then one of the questions was, what are the reserved matters on the planning? In other words, even though planning is granted, the lender is asking what hoops do we still need to jump through to be able to start the development? In other words, do we have to submit different things in writing? Do we have to give some more detailed plans? Like, for example, if we've said in our planning application we're going to create space for putting 10 bikes, but we haven't specified how we're going to do it. We can receive the planning approval, but the planning approval will say, submit details of how you're going to do this, or it might say submit details of the roofing materials and different things. And so getting everything in the full planning in advance can save a lot of time later. Then we've got permitted development rights. So this means basically we can do changes without without going through full planning. We're going to still submit, but it's shorter delays, and generally the approval is granted within like 1 month or so, 2 months sometimes, and we can get on with the development. Permitted development, when we're talking like as investors and property developers, we're thinking more specifically about things like change of use to HMO, or converting commercial to residential. Permitted development also applies to standard houses. If it's a small extension, there are certain rules which mean we don't have to go for full planning, and we can do that under permitted development. Full planning, by the way, is public information. So if you submit a planning application, that's on planning portal, it's on the local council's planning portal, and everyone knows that you've submitted that application. And that's also useful in the other way when we're looking at properties to buy, or if we're thinking of doing some particular development, we're going to look at if someone's already done that in the area. If, for example, we're looking at adding a story onto a block of flats, and there's precedent of that, and we can look at the planning details for that, then that can be reassuring. Prior approval, so that is required for permitted development. We're just asking for prior approval to confirm that everything is fine. And there's one thing I think I realized actually I missed off here. And this is pre-application advice, or the different terms. Previously, it was called like pre-planning advice, and different councils might use different terms for it. This is like a semi-formal process where it's possible to submit like outline planning or an overall idea of what we want to do on a piece of land or with a property. It goes into the planning department. We have to pay for it. It costs less than full planning, and then we get a reply. It can be 1 or 2 months later saying, in principle, this would be approved, but the planning department saying, but we recommend that if you do this and this and change it like that, it has a higher chance of being approved. And the key thing with this process is it's completely private. So if a developer or an owner puts in this application for pre-planning advice, for example, is such a conversion possible, then the owner can decide either to share that with, but if it's like, if for example it's favourable and it says planning permission is likely to be granted for converting this building into 10 flats, for example, and then we want to sell it without applying for the full planning permission, then we're going to disclose that and say, look, we've got that. If, however, we want to maybe doing something different and we don't want to disclose it, then that's also possible. And then the last thing on here, we've got the change of use applications, which is when we're changing, from, for example, standard residential to HMO, office to residential, when we can't do it under permitted development. In reality, we're calling this change of use applications, but it is still going through full planning process. It's just a different type of planning, rather than saying we're going to be building this and that, and this we're going to say we've got an existing building, we're going to be changing its use, potentially at the same time with some small changes within the building. Then a brief overview of the key planning authorities and regulations. So we've got local planning authorities, which is where we're submitting the applications. There is a national planning policy framework, which is national government. This is national as in national for England, national for Wales, and most likely there are similar things in Scotland and Northern Ireland. Building relations isn't directly related to planning, but it's here as like local as regulations that exist. When we're putting in a planning application, planning can be granted, but that doesn't mean to say that we can still satisfy all building regulations. Like when we're putting planning in, we might, in order to get a favourable response, say we're going to do it like to a high energy standard or something like that. But then it's building regulations that is going to determine how we're actually doing everything and how we're going to be doing the building. And then when we're listed buildings or conservation areas, there are additional authorities that's necessary to consult. In England, historic England is dealing with that. And green belt, also there can be, if we're looking at doing development on the edge of green belt, there can be also additional considerations. So brief overview of the process. So yeah, we can do the pre-application consultation, which is private, site assessment, feasibility, also doing costings and things. Then we're submitting the planning application. There's public consultation and review. Sometimes there might, if it's a big development, there might be public meetings. The fact that everyone is complaining that you're going to be doing an HMO in their neighbourhood isn't something really to worry about, because at the end of the day, it's a question of following the rules and guidelines that have been set by the local authority. If it ticks all those boxes, even if everyone around don't like it, it should still get passed. So there's a decision made on a local planning authority, and if that decision is unfavourable, and this happens sometimes, I just mentioned the case of an HMO, even though theoretically an application for an HMO should have been passed because it complies with all the sort of guidelines, for like political reasons, a local authority will refuse it because everyone's complaining. And then we've got the appeals process. So that goes to a central government planning inspectorate. In England, that's in Bristol. For Wales, it's in Cardiff. And there's an independent decision on whether planning will be granted or not. So there's a lot of cases, for example, in the HMOs where it's refused by the local planning authority, but it's on appeals, it's accepted. So appeals in some cases can be almost like a standard part of the procedure if we're dealing with local authorities that like refusing things, and we know that we're following the guidelines. Don't be worried about going to appeals. It's like standard thing. It's not like sort of going to court. It's like, yeah, it's just like the last part of the process. If appeals is rejected, it is possible to go a step higher, but generally we're not going to do that because there's little chance of success. So common planning challenges and how to overcome them. We've spoken a little bit about objections from neighbours. It's not generally a big issue, but sometimes, yeah, consultations and keeping people informed can be useful. Delays in approval, getting the original planning as detailed as possible, so there aren't going to be lots of additional questions, and if there are questions, to not take a long time answering them. And like a obvious but sometimes overlooked thing, if there are a series of questions that come in from the planning officer, typically via the planning consultant, rather than answer them one at a time, answer them all in one go. So when it goes back to the planning department, they can consider everything in one go rather than do a little bit and then park it and then do a little bit more. Yeah, obviously, if we're talking environmental and heritage constraints. So yeah, if we're dealing with listed buildings or in conservation areas, take more care in preparing things and consult with the right people. Financial considerations, all these things have a cost associated with it. So budget for that, and yeah, infrastructure and access issues, things like the splays on when exiting a property onto public highway and stuff like that. And then some best practices. I'm not going to go in a lot of detail on this, but in reality, the one that I would most, in fact, the two, but the most important one I would say is engage with experienced planning consultants. Oops, sorry. Engage with experienced planning consultants, architects, and legal advisors. Good planning consultants obviously will cost more money than, let's say, more basic planning consultants, one that might be in a different area, but it's generally well worth identifying good experienced planning consultants, typically ones that have worked for the planning departments and that have experience in the type of development that you're doing, because planning delays or refusals in planning are extremely costly and probably 10 times more costly than the extra cost of employing a good planning consultant, sometimes legal advisors as well. So that is number one. And then at the same time, however, conduct thorough research on local planning policies and potential constraints. Don't rely on the planning consultant to do everything. And remember, it's your project and you're like sort of guiding it and thinking about it in the same way, like when you're going to see an accountant or tax advisor, You're not just going to go there. Well, hopefully, his recommendation, not just go there out of the blue and say, how can you optimize my taxes? Obviously, you're going to say that, but you're going to do some research and look at the potential possibilities so that when you're having that discussion, you can discuss that in like, yeah, an intelligent way and get the most out of it. So, yeah, these things you can read at leisure. So let's open it up to questions and answers. So does anyone have a question on what we've covered on planning?
Trevor, that thing that you said about the HMOs and the appeals process, um, and you mentioned that that's almost like a standard part of the process. How long does that appeals process take? Right? Because I think what was it, the average planning lead time, I think is what, 56 days, right? I don't know if that's changed materially, but
No, but it's never, I've never seen a planning gone through in 56 days, but that is the official one, yes.
yeah. So what's your experience then before appeals on how long the process takes? And
Well,
then
for the medium, small to medium things, we're probably talking in general about 4 months in practice.
that's a
Um,
long time.
And
That's a
there's
long time.
always, even if everything's perfectly prepared,
Yeah.
there's always going to be questions. And if there aren't questions, then the people in the planning departments can invent some questions to gather to get a bit of time, sort of thing. But
And the appeals process for HMOs, how much additional time does that end up taking?
it could be between like 2 to 3 months, something like that. It's not except it's not like years or 6 months. It's reasonably fast. It obviously isn't guaranteed. And it depends if the case is if it's like a standard HMO that's been refused and the reasons aren't like sort of valid, then it can be like a question of yeah, 1 to 2 months to get the feedback from the um yeah, from the appeals.
You might be talking about like 6 months to get approval for HMO.
Yeah,
Wow.
unfortunately that's the case.
And so your mitigation, is it that, we talked about it in one of the other modules, as like you take an option to buy subject to satisfactory planning so that you're
Yeah,
not
but I mean
permitting
that's
your
true. But at the end of the day, if it's a really good deal,
yeah.
then and people, developers, or you've spoken with local consultants who say there's a really high chance of getting the HMO planning, then probably unless it's really off market, it's quite possible you won't be able to get that option to purchase. In which case, you need to decide if, for example, the property is in good condition, you could operate it as serviced accommodation whilst applying for the planning to go to an HMO.
Okay.
Yeah. Or if it needs renovation, you could start the renovation, but leave off the things that are maybe very specific to it being to getting the HMO planning.
Yeah.
Because if you do like an HMO of 4 bedrooms, like away, or you've got 3 bedrooms upstairs and you're going to use one of the reception rooms and you're doing a full renovation, well, put all the fire doors in, your smoke alarms and everything while you're doing it. Put your wiring in for the emergency lights because it's not going to, it might add a couple of thousand on the budget. But at the end of the day, nice, solid fire doors are still like attractive on if it's going to end up being a family home or you're going to do supported living or social housing with it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you make progress where you can. Um,
Yes. Because
and
generally the option to purchase is not so much because you're based on like getting planning or not. is generally to be able to have more time to increase the value of the property, so that you can either sell or refinance and buy the property without using any of your own money apart from the option fee and the apart from the option fee and the ongoing lease that you're paying every month.
Your premise is that subject to, let's say, your planning consultant saying that HMO approval is quite likely to go ahead and acquire, operate as something else, make some use of the property, or make progress on building work that you can
Yes.
until you've got the approval. Got it. Okay.
Yeah, that's right. Yes, yes.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
Does anyone else have a question?
Yeah, Trevor, I had one.
Yeah.
So I know you covered neighbor consultation as well. So, I mean, based off the question you've just answered there, would that be part of the entire duration as you're doing the plan? I guess I'm trying to get to understand what the
It's part
process
of it's
is.
part of the entire duration, because
Okay.
what happens
Okay.
generally when you put the what happen well not in fact what always happens is when you put that application in, then that application appears on the planning portal, and some people might be looking at it anyway and notice it, or someone might notice and say to a friend, oh, do you know that someone's put planning in for an HMO, or someone's going to be building that?
Mhm.
But and then in general, I say in general because it's not, I think, always the case, the local planning authority are sending out letters with a copy of the planning, or saying there's planning on in this building which is next to you. Do you have any comments?
Right.
And there's and however, all comments are public information. So anyone
Right.
that objects, for example, to any neighbours that object to planning will their objections will be public information
Okay.
with
So
their
the
names as well. It can't be
so okay.
anonymous.
Okay. So as part of that planning, that process, then the the planning process does give them a timeline to object to that planning
That's right,
that
yes.
you've put together. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Understood.
In general,
Is
when
that
you look at these, it's the all the objections are without basis, because all the objections are saying it might be a bit noisy, or it might be this, that, and the other,
mm,
or I don't like the neighbour, or something like that. And all these basically have no weight with respect to planning. If someone really wanted to object, they would try, well, object intelligently, then they would try and dig in the local planning guidelines and things, and say, well, there's public transport nearby, but there's one bus every 3 hours. Therefore, and there's no parking. We don't think it's a good idea. And when there's things like that, those are the sort of like replies to be a bit more concerned about, because they're getting into things that are closer to real planning guidelines. Because if someone like objects on that basis, the planning officer in reality is like obliged to study that and understand if that objection is valid. So if, for example, the planning officer wasn't going to check the bus timetable and determine that the application which said there's public transport by nearby is in fact rubbish public transport, that's fine.
mhm.
But if someone puts in a comment saying we don't agree that there's good public transport, then he has to look at that.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions?
Yeah, hi Trev.
Yeah, hi Keith.
Trevor.
I'm sure you're going to ask a question, and you've probably got
Yeah,
some,
no, I put
maybe a
some in the
nice case
chat.
study to present us.
They're in the chat.
Sorry?
I put the questions in the chat.
Oh, sorry, I've somehow missed the. Would you mind saying them, Keith, please?
Okay, one was, do you use any specific tools to check out planning applications on properties you're interested in?
So yeah, the answer to that one is not specific tools as in things like property filters and things like that, but we always look at the planning portal to see what prior planning has been on there.
Right, because obviously, like you said, sometimes you have to study the street or the neighborhood
Yeah.
properties to see what's going on. So that's why I asked anything that make it a
Yeah,
bit
yeah,
efficient.
and in general as well, we'll rather than putting the specific when we're looking at a property, it's also going to say part laziness. We'll just grab the postcode of the property that we're looking at, put that in the planning portal, and then that planning portal will bring up like maybe 10, 15 planning applications on the street, and including the one that we're specifically looking for. So that will give us an idea. And if it's like a serious project, like a bigger project, like I think at the weekend we were looking at a hotel in Earl's Court, and we were thinking what could we potentially do with that to this is on behalf like for an investor, what would we be able to add an extra level? And so we were looking on the same street. There was one building that did have an extra level, and we noted to yeah, have a look, find out the planning for that. And there was another hotel that was being completely renovated.
Right.
So we thought, yeah, let's have a look at what they're doing.
Okay. The next question was obviously gaining planning permission and approval varies from council to council. Is there any website that might give you an idea on you know, the performance of particular council? I know some councils are actually terrible, so sometimes it might be in your interest to know this terrible or talk with them all together.
In practice, I would say no. And even if it existed, my preference is always to look on Google, find search for planning consultants or town planners in the area, pick up the phone and ask them,
Right.
and say, what's it like in this area? How long does it take for planning? Like once we were looking at something in Monmouthshire. We're actually doing a project in Monmouthshire, and we phoned I think 2 or 3 planning consultants who said they're surprising, they're really efficient and fast. And once we were
Okay.
looking at a project in Walsall in the West Midlands, and I phoned a couple of planning consultants, and they said it's dreadful, takes ages. Yeah, they said that it can take a simple thing can take 9 months up to a year. So that
Right.
really is the best way of finding out. But don't just phone one, because one might be biased or have some specific bad experience, or might be a planning consultant that the planning department don't like, for example.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, this thing of speaking with planning consultants is, I would say, a major recommendation. And I know, Keith, we were talking about a project in Epsom.
Yeah.
We actually spoke on this one with, well, I spoke with 3 different planning consultants to get their opinion on it. So yeah, whatever project you're doing, and if, for example, if you had been interested in this project, even if I said to you, I've spoken with a couple of planning consultants, then it's your necessary due diligence also to do the same, not
Yeah.
just take for granted what well, if it's me, maybe you'll take for granted. I'm joking. But yeah, whoever it is, don't take for granted, and get your own opinion by phoning a couple of
So talking about that deal we're talking about, what do they say about the planning on that? Is it likely to happen? I'm just curious because obviously you've done more homework on that than I have.
yes. So they said it is likely to happen.
Yeah.
What they said, this for everyone listening, this is a mixed use property, so it's got a small commercial unit, and then it's basically a house behind and above it. So what we found out was, and it's a listed building as well, and we wanted to what we were planning to do is actually keep the commercial and then convert the house into an HMO. And what the two planning consultants gave us, and we said it's historic, it's listed building, but we think it's only the facade that is listed.
Right.
And then both of them said, beware, if you think it's only the facade, it might be more, and you sort of would need to find out.
Right.
Which is good advice. And then they said, in reality, because afterwards we found out that he'd already had planning permission to convert, because previously it was commercial on the whole of the ground floor. It had planning permission to renovate and create a larger house, and there weren't any specific conditions related to things inside the property. So that gives us reassurance. And also we had advice on that one. We were looking to create a 7-bedroom HMO. For those who took part in the HMO thing, you may remember that when we're above 6 beds, it's no longer standard C4 HMO, but it goes into a different planning class, sui generis. And as we're in England, we can go from C3 to C4 and under permitted development, so it's a simpler process. When it's a listed building, it's permitted development, but it has to have specific authorization to be able to go ahead with so it's like certificate of lawful development to do permitted development in this case. And the advice was to go first of all for the 6 bedrooms, and then as soon as that is granted, go for full planning to get the additional one. And we did our figures such that if we don't get the 7th one, it's still a good deal for us.
Okay.
So yeah, it's always important to take advice. And then obviously that advice is not generally you don't have time to go to the to do actual pre-planning advice from the local planning department. So you just need to take the opinions of the people, unless you like Vatsal was saying, unless you're able to agree a option to purchase, in which case that gives more time to well, if you've got the option to purchase anyway, you might just go ahead with the full planning because you've got the time to do it, rather than fiddle around with the pre-planning advice. On the pre-planning advice thing, not by the way, it's a useful piece of information, and the planning consultants will advise on that. There are some councils or planning departments that are upset if you don't consult them beforehand. And so if you go through without pre-planning, there's a higher chance of being refused or it being more complicated. And if you do the pre-planning advice, then there's a higher, obviously you've got that advice. And then occasionally, if you're doing that for something that's fairly straightforward, there might be some councils that say, why are you wasting our time? You're just putting an application sort of thing. And that you can't find out on the internet. You can only find that. And also if you're in a network with other property investors and developers, ask around, ask on the WhatsApp chat, does anyone have any experience on doing this particular thing? Anyone dealt with Croydon Council, for example, or something like that? Do you have any other questions, Keith? So I'm sorry, I don't have the
no other question. The only comment I've got to make is I have seen people do pre-application applications, and it's normally for like really, really big schemes. Is the stuff we're talking about. But if you're doing a really big scheme like 40 flats or pulling down 4 buildings, then it's probably it's advisable to go that way. But for what we're doing, I don't think you have to worry about that at this stage in our journey.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, sometimes, the thing is, if you, for example, you want to, I don't know, we want to convert into a maximum number of flats, rather than go in for 8 and get it refused. If we put the pre-planning in and say we want to do 8, or you actually, what sometimes people advise is exaggerate and say we want to do 12. So that they say 12's too many, but you can do 8. But if you ask for 8, they'll say 8's too many, you can only do 6.
Yeah.
And then because obviously the pre-planning does give some weight on the full planning, but it's not obviously binding.
Okay.
Right. Does anyone else have any questions? Anyone like to share any experience of dealing with planning? I think we've covered quite a lot, so I shan't add anything now.
So, Trevor, that comment about using planning consultants, I mean, I have spoken to planning consultants, and in general, it seems like a good idea. But I was at a property network. I think it was Partners, Property Partners, or something like. I can't remember. Sorry, it was PPN. Sorry, and I spoke to a developer who builds blocks of flats from the ground up. And he said one of the challenges he found with planning consultants is that the ones that he used initially were just too friendly with the planning department. And so it was that they weren't challenging certain decisions or certain requirements that the planning department was making, right? And he chose to use planning consultants from out of area because he felt like the planning consultants locally were too pally with the planning
Yes.
department. Is that a thing? Have you come across that? I mean, it sounds like you've had generally good experience, but is that
I
something you need to
haven't
watch out for?
specifically come across that,
Yeah,
but that also is partly countered. You remember there's one slide I was like going on a bit about understanding how things work yourself.
yeah,
And there, even if you've got a planning consultant that is a bit too pally and is thinking of doing concessions, you need to be able to say to him, look, why are you doing that concession? My understanding of the local planning policy is that we can do this and they shouldn't be objected to. Can we not try that? And
yeah.
obviously then if he's too pally and you don't get any feedback on that, then yeah, don't use that planning consultant.
And at what point do you choose to use a planning consultant versus an architect that's submitted a number of similar applications that have been approved with the authority that, because there are obviously a number of architects that will take you through planning.
Yes. It's just general, the type of projects that I'm doing aren't like sort of full-blown architect type projects. And that our planning consultants are putting in probably 10 times the number of planning applications than an architect, because an architect is doing the full work. Well, architects sometimes are just doing the planning applications, but in general, they're doing the design and the full works. So the planning consultants tend to have more coverage. But yeah, but architects are like submitting applications. And what generally I will always do if we're looking at development for which there's planning permission, or if planning permission has been refused, generally a good thing is that you can see on the owners' names on the planning portal are redacted. That means they're like blanked out. But the architects or the planning consultants' names are on there. So you can find them on internet and then give them a call and say, we're looking at, generally say, all right, we're looking at maybe buying this property. I see that you did the planning. Can you tell us a bit about why it was refused, or what do you think about this? Or I see that you can even, sometimes architects like talking quite often. So if you see something that was done 4 flats and you think it's possible to get 6 in there, you can say to the architect, I see you did 4 maybe to make bigger ones. But do you think if we were to do 6 and like explain a bit, And the architect then might say, obviously it's only his opinion, he might say there's no way you'll get 6 there because of this, this, and this, and then you got the information. Or the architect might say, yeah, that's fine, I suggested that, but the owner didn't want it. You can get all sorts of useful information by speaking with the people that put in the application. And the same thing as if you're looking to buy a property that had some renovation work on it, and then the builders or the owners ran out of money, so they're selling it. You may have, if you go to the property, you'll see potentially the builder's name on there. You give them a call. It's all about like people and networking and getting as much information as possible to be able. The idea is not to spend ages thinking about it and thinking I'm going to get this information. It's to get maximum information in one go, to then do the calculations and think about it and make a decision on it. All right, well, thank you all for your time. I think next week we're going to be talking about commercial to residential conversions, and then the following one is going to be pure commercial investments. And so we're going to finish the call. The recordings will be available on YouTube afterwards, as are all the others. So thank you for your time and have a good evening.
Thanks, Trevor.
Thanks, Trevor. Thanks.
Bye.
Cheers. Thank you.